The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GALA webinar series. My name is Manuela Noske, and I'm the Communications Manager here at GALA. GALA is a global nonprofit trade association supporting the language industry. We are headquartered in Seattle, Washington, in the United States, and today we're going to have a presentation by Jack Weldy. And we're so pleased that each of you could join us from various locations all around the world to participate in the event. I will hand it over to Jack in just a moment, but first I have a few housekeeping items to go over. We have muted everyone's lines to cut down on any background noise. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can let me know by using a chat box, and I will work with you to troubleshoot them. If you have a slow internet connection, your audio may be disrupted. If that happens, you can use the number listed on the GoToWebinar panel to call in using your own phone. We are making a recording of this presentation, and you will be able to find it following the presentation on GALA's global website. All participants will receive a link. This is a talk that Jack was planning to give at the GALA Boston conference, but due to the blizzard, he wasn't able to get to Boston. Keeping in mind that this presentation was supposed to be delivered before a live audience, we will try something a little different today. Namely, Jack is going to ask a few questions, and we ask you to type your answers and ideas into your question box. I will then read them out to Jack so he gets a little feedback from you. If you have any other questions, feel free to type those into your question box as well, and we will attend to those at the end of the presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to take just a moment to introduce our speaker. Jack Weldy is a technology early adopter, serial entrepreneur, software patent holder, product evangelist, and combat decorated Air Force pilot. Before founding SmartLing, he served as SVP of product at eMusic and CTO at She Speaks and Runtime Technologies. He also co-founded Trio Development, a software company that created the first personal information manager, which was acquired by Apple in 1993. He holds a BS in computer engineering from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied on linguistics and interned with well-known Professor William Labov, and an MBA from Cameron University in Germany. So now, without any further ado, Jack, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Manuel. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and when you may be watching this. That was a terrific intro. Thank you. I need to shorten that bio, I think, for for the future stuff. Hey, I'm excited about this. Manuel, as you mentioned, this was originally going to be a presentation that I was going to do at GALA Boston earlier this year. And I think as many people who attended and people who tried to attend, boy, the weather really didn't help us out that day. Kudos to all the folks that actually made it there. I bought about 4 different versions of flights. I had a train. I pretty much tried every way to get there, but every single one of them got canceled and didn't make it. So I'm still using my slides that still show respectfully the GALA Boston 18 hashtag, and because this was the presentation I was going to give at that conference, and so I'm excited about it. And as Manuela said, what I would like to do is I'd like to get some good engagement from the audience, because I want to hear some of the ideas that people are thinking about here, and then I'll talk a little bit about the way we think about it, maybe show a quick demo of a couple things that I think could be interesting. All right, so let me start with what is SmartLing, in case you don't know who SmartLing is. SmartLing is a company based out of New York City. I founded the company about 8 years ago. I'm the CEO. Our mission is to make translation easy. And we do that by providing a set of simple, powerful tools to help companies to translate their products and content. And this is the software platform. And so we are very focused on automation. We're very focused on properly capturing content, organizing it, contextualizing it, and routing it to the appropriate translation processes. And data is a big part of that. So let's talk a little bit about data today. So data, everybody is talking about data everywhere. And you're probably starting to see the way that data is impacting your professional lives. You're starting to think about the way that the data is impacting your personal lives. And so before we really jump into my presentation. I want to see if we can get some good audience participation here going. So if you're listening today live, here's an idea. Let's talk about where is data impacting the world today. And Manuela, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, let's have people type these right into the question box. What are some different ideas of areas where you think data is impacting the world today? And then Manuela, I might ask you to read out a couple of them. So let's go ahead and do that now.
Sure, so folks, go ahead.
Where's data impacting the world today?
All right, social media is an answer. GDPR, Euro privacy.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Everything, genetics, marketing. Probably
awesome.
Probably everything, says somebody. Yep.
Probably everything. Let's see what I came up with just off the top of my head. Social networks, mobile engagement, e-commerce, music, Wall Street, advertising, experience management, Netflix. I like GDPR. GDPR is a terrific one. Everybody is going to be affected by GDPR. And just to comment about that a little bit, that GDPR becomes effective May 25th, and companies are scrambling to make sure that they are GDPR compliant. And GDPR isn't really complicated. It basically just says, hey, we know that you're going to use our data. We know that you're going to use data about people. Give us a bit more control about how you're going to use our data, and give me, the individual, the chance to say, hey, I don't want you to use my data like that, or I want to disengage from this, or I'd like to have a bit more control about that data. It's a bit of golden rule, do unto others as you'd like to have done to yourself. And but that's a really terrific one. But I agree with basically data is impacting everywhere. Really good suggestions, guys. Thanks for playing along. I'll have a couple other ones here. Netflix is an interesting one, and I was just, this was a little bit earlier in the year when we were doing the GALA presentation up in Boston. But I don't know if everybody saw this story, but I thought this was pretty interesting and pretty amusing. I think we know that big companies like Facebook, like Netflix, are certainly using data in super interesting ways. But this was sort of a fun, easy, sort of a little bit cheesy, a little bit campy sort of Netflix movie that came out right around the holidays. And it was called A Christmas Prince. And then at some point towards the end of the year, Netflix tweeted out this, to the 53 people who have watched A Christmas Prince every day for the past 18 years, who hurt you? So that's sort of funny. It's sort of funny that there are 53 people out there who watched a movie, this sort of silly holiday movie, 18 days in a row. But what's even more interesting is that Netflix knew that, and they knew precisely who those people were. And they were able to say, boy, we actually have a fair amount of insight about these individual people, and perhaps they might have had something happen in their past personal lives that caused them to want to be able to do that. That is really, really targeted data. I thought that was a really interesting sort of point of view here. So now let's talk about much more specifically and more granularly, what about the language services industry? So again, I'm going to ask you, thank you for the participation, folks. I'm going to ask you to go to your question box, and let's talk a little bit about where data is or will impact the language services industry. And Manuela, as they come in, would you mind reading out some of the good ones, please?
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead, folks, and type in your answers and ideas. So here's one. How would Netflix use? Okay, maybe this is related. How would Netflix use this data to determine where to localize? Okay.
Interesting.
All right.
Yeah. How about just data? How is data being used today in a more interesting way than perhaps it was a decade ago? How's data impacting the language service industry? And where do we think data is going to play, over the next 1, 2, 5, 10 years?
Yeah. If you've got any other ideas, folks, type them in now before we move on.
Otherwise, I'm going to tell you my ideas.
Mm-hmm. Looks like no other ideas are coming. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, let's talk about a couple of them. Obviously, neural machine translation is data intensive, and that is something that is top of mind for a lot of people. Quality assessment, search engine optimization, margin optimization. As an LSP, how do I continue to optimize my margins and increase and provide the right kinds and the right amount of margin? Terminology management, supply chain management, content profiling. What kind of content is it that I'm translating? Is it marketing content? Is it legal content? How much metadata is associated with that content? Is it long tail e-commerce content? All of these service level agreements, quality assessment, all of these are absolutely critical and data intensive. And there are things that we're encountering right now and that we're dealing with right now in the industry. And again, the answer is everywhere. I mean, data is going to become the key important factor in pretty much everything that we're doing as an industry right now. And so I want to talk a little bit about the way that we think about it. Number one, we think data is around people. Data can be organized around people. Now, this can be part of your supply chain. It can be, as an LSP, you're working with a variety of translators around the world. You may be working with other LSPs. And when you combine people and a variety of different things that go into managing people, understanding people, what they're good at, what areas they're not particularly good at, what their past performance is, what their expected future performance is going to look like, that's one. Another one is content. What type of content and all the different variables and data around the content that you are translating. I'm going to talk about that one. And then finally, data around process. So when we think about data and organizing them, we think about it as people, content, process. And in this presentation, you're going to see the way we track and organize and think about and talk about and leverage data around people, content, and process. So let's hit a couple of these things. Interestingly, LSPs and their clients have similar challenges. LSPs and their clients have similar challenges. If we were to think about people and the challenges that both LSPs and customers are facing, we think some of the important ones are availability of qualified people. I want to make sure that I'm working with the absolute best providers that are helping me to create and manage and translate global content. And in a lot of cases, the availability of qualified people is really challenging. The second one is inefficient communication. Am I able to communicate very, very clearly and crisply between my customer, between the LSP, and in many cases, directly to the freelance translator or the translator that's part of your supply chain, either internally or externally, that's working on the translation and localization process. And interestingly, what we're hearing at SmartLink is more and more that our customers want more of a direct communication relationship with the person or people that are actually doing the translation. And it's not because they want to go direct and they want to go around the LSP or whatever. They want to make sure that they know that the person or people that are doing the translation, that he or she feels like an extension of their team. And the communication and all the data associated with it and any inefficiencies that arise out of this are really becoming important critical issues for both LSPs and their customers. Also, how do you resolve issues in a timely fashion? What happens if a customer, one of your clients says, hey, we really need to accelerate this thing. We just put it in and, but we need to move this to the top of the queue and it really needs to be done by tomorrow. Or on the other side, what happens when a translator says, hey, I've got bad news. This piece of content that you asked me to translate isn't going to fit inside of the mobile app that it was designed for. Or, hey, it looks like the client concatenated a couple strings here inside of their web application that shouldn't be concatenated. That's not going to translate well. Or any other things. Hey, what does this mean? What are the things that are going on here? Any kind of lack of timely issue resolution, data can help to understand that. And then what about internal review? So many customers, they want to incorporate an internal review process into the translation process. They want to send their content out to an LSP. They want it to go through the normal, translation and or editing process or whatever the appropriate workflow is for that content. And then oftentimes the client wants to do an internal review, but that can become a real serious bottleneck that can become very, very challenging. So what are some other challenges that LSPs and clients have beyond people? The second one is content parsing issues. Just things like, hey, can I get my content out of my content management system? Can I get my content out of my Adobe Experience Manager, my Sitecore, my WordPress, my Drupal Acquia? What about my marketing platforms, my Marketo or my Eloqua or Salesforce? What about my CRM? What about my support content, my e-commerce platform? How do I get content out of all these things? How do I make sure it's parsed properly and organized in a way that makes sense for my LSP partner and for the translator who is eventually going to do that translation and or localization process? Visual context is another really important one. In fact, SmartLink thinks visual context is so critically important and is one of the key drivers in high quality translation. And if you don't have it, well, you can run into all kinds of problems, obviously. And this audience on this webinar is a sophisticated audience that's probably been doing this for many, many years or decades, in fact. But I know that we all run into places where lack of visual context leads to ambiguity, or it leads to potential problems. Does home mean my homepage, or does it mean, where I live? Does okay mean okay in a button, or does it mean Oklahoma? Well, boy, if you don't get that context right, that can lead to all kinds of embarrassing or confusing issues. And even when you understand what it looks like, and what the right context is and what the appropriate translation should be, the way that companies are creating content today means that visual context is so important in organizing and gathering all that content into an organized, ordered way so that it makes sense to the translator, and when he or she does the translation, that everything reads beautifully. Agile. Every company's trying to be agile out there. Every single company wants to move faster, and as a result of that, that means that they are embracing the concept of agile, which generally means smaller batches, and I've got a typo there, that should say fast turnaround. Small batches of content with a fast turnaround on a continuous basis. So companies are creating content, monthly, weekly, daily, even hourly. And that has always been a really challenging problem for the translation industry, that how do I handle small batches on a continuous basis with a very fast turnaround? And the other challenge is there's an increasing number of content platforms. I talked about some of them in this first bullet, but you've got more CMSs, you've got more e-commerce platforms, more marketing platforms, more support platforms, more CRM platforms. And when you put all these things together, there's a massive amount of problems around content that LSPs and clients share. And then these will resonate, I think, very easily with LSPs, so I'll hit these fairly quickly. But there are process challenges that LSPs and clients have. Out-of-date translation memories, missing linguistic assets, maybe you don't have your term base properly, maybe you don't have the updated style guide, maybe you don't have the latest and greatest TM. There can be challenges with working offline. I don't have good visibility into what my translators are doing right now and where they are in their process, and can I understand and gather all the data that's associated with that process? There are challenges with working online. Do I want to use online tools? What if I don't have a good internet connection? Or what if, how do I collaborate more effectively in each of these? So there's challenges with offline and online, and naturally processes lead to bottlenecks. It's great to have a very, very sophisticated 10-step workflow process, but if one of those workflow processes breaks down because somebody's on vacation, or they're not available today, or they didn't understand what they were supposed to do, that can lead to bottlenecks that are very, very serious and can really slow down the entire train. And then collaboration issues. How do you effectively collaborate between internal and external resources, between the customer, the LSP, the translator? These can all be real challenges to process. So how do we solve these issues? How can we solve these issues? And the answer is start with data. Start with data. Understand what you're measuring. Understand what's important to measure. Understand the things that can help you to first identify what's going on with your people, content, and processes. And then once you've measured that, then figure out, how do I make improvements? Maybe I need to make improvements. Maybe I don't need to make improvements. But start with data around people, content, and process, and establish metrics. What are the things that are really, really important from a turnaround time perspective, from a cost perspective, from a margin perspective, from a performance perspective, from a quality perspective? What are the metrics that you would expect? And by gathering this data, by understanding what your current processes are, by setting targets around particular metrics, then you can say, hey, are we living up to those metrics? Are we living up to the SLAs that we aspire, the service level agreements we aspire to provide to our customers? Are we living up to the service level agreements that we've told our customers we're going to live up to from here? Are we living up to the metrics that are important to the sustainability of our own business? So let's talk about a handful of what these things are. These are just some ideas. And what I might ask is, to think about how you might augment this with your own metrics and the things that are important to your own LSP. Every LSP is a little bit different, and we operate in a very, very big fragmented market, of course. And so depending on what your specialty is and your focus and the kinds of things that are important, you might have different metrics that you might want to use to make an informed decision. So here's a couple of things that we like to think about at SmartLing around people. What is the translator's experience with particular content or industry content? Where are they located? Is my translator for French located in Paris? How about my Chinese translator? Is he or she in Beijing? You know, what's the location of the translation? Can we look at the number of words over time that have been translated or edited or reviewed by a particular vendor or a particular translation resource? How many issues have been created for translators' work over time? If a translator is asking too many questions, that could be a problem. But it's also a problem if the translator is not asking any questions. If they're not creating issues to say, hey, I've got a question about this, or I've got a concern about this. If you're not getting any issues, that's probably unusual as well. Where are people in their own scheduling? Where do they have idle time? Where is it challenging when they make context switches, moving from very specific transcreation, locale-specific copywriting of taglines? You know, sometimes that can be really tricky to transition into when you're changing and switching context from, you know, long-tail e-commerce content or legal content. Sometimes that can be exactly what people want. They need to take a break from one thing and move to a different thing. So where are those context switches, and are you even able to determine things like what type of content people are using? What kind of tools are people using? Are they using an appropriate term base? Are they making good use of style guides? Are they using the right terminology and glossary? And you have quality checks that can check and make sure that people are using the tools effectively to say, hey, you're doing a good job here, and quality checks around people's performance. Here's an interesting one that we find pretty interesting. It's a little bit nuanced here, but one of the things that SmartLing platform tracks, it tracks edit distance for every single translator that's ever translated anything in our system. And this is a little bit like a fuzzy match, and it basically says that if if I'm a translator and you're a translator and we both have translated, the same amount of content over a 5-year period, and we're both about the same rate, and we're both the same experience levels, and we're both delightfully, easy to deal with and to work with, we're both roughly the same person. But if you looked at the red line difference, the fuzzy difference between what I've translated versus what you've translated, and it turns out that there's a lot more distance, a lot more red line distance in my translation versus what the final translation turned out to be, you're probably a better translator than I am. Again, all things being equal. So these are, just really interesting examples of the kinds of things that we can do around people, and just thinking about things like concurrent logins.
Hey, before you move away, Jack, there is a question here about what concurrent logins are. That's a concept that the audience doesn't know. What are concurrent logins?
Yeah, perfect. Good. Mm-hmm. Good. So concurrent logins, there are always concerns about who's doing my translation, who's actually doing my translation. And this industry has often sort of said, hey, we don't necessarily want that transparency between who's doing my actual translation, that my client, I don't necessarily want my customer to really understand who's doing my actual translation. I'd love to flip that on its head and say, hey, I think that kind of transparency is really, really important. And I don't think that there's too much of a concern where, LSPs should be worried about that their customers are going to go direct. If that's your worry, that's a much bigger problem. And I think that, people want to know who's logging in where, and am I outsourcing this to a translator who then is outsourcing it to another translator? Are we outsourcing it to places that, like different countries or different locations or different experiences and things like that? And so these are the kinds of things to watch for. And, if I was outsourcing it to a translator who was doing my French translation out of Paris, and then all of a sudden, 10 minutes later, the same translator in theory is logging in, out of South Carolina, that might be a red flag that something's not working quite right. So lots and lots of different metrics. And honestly, this is just a smattering of those different types of things. Thank you, Manuela. So let's talk about content. Source content quality. Boy, this is a big one. If the customer is creating really, really poor quality source content, then how can you expect to get really high quality translations? And this is one that customers often forget about. And then they want to say, oh boy, we're not happy with the quality of the translation. Well, how is the quality of the source content? Can you actually measure that? Can you actually try to figure out what some of the things are that are influencing good, high quality source content? What about complexity? Are you translating something that every single sentence is 68 words, or do you have, tight, crisp, short word sentences? Is it heavy technical, legal, or aerospace content, or is it, straightforward product descriptions? What about the type of content? Is it images? Is it HTML with a lot of embedded tags? Is it complex formats like XML? Is it video? What about language pairs? Is it some of the more common language pairs, or is it challenging language pairs? I don't know too many Swedish to Hebrew translators and language pairs out there, and you have to do some pivots. Are there good instructions right down to the paragraph level or string level, and are those presented and being reviewed? Are high TM matches available? So I don't want to read through all of the different things right here. You can certainly read the slides here, but there are a number of different things around the content itself that can really help to figure out the kinds of metrics to make informed decisions about this. If you have, for example, very complex source content that's of low quality in a very heavy technical format like XML with a lot of tags, with high string lengths, with spelling errors, and a million placeholders and non-translatables, I can tell you right now that's going to be a really complex, challenging, very challenging set of content to translate. So let's also talk a little bit about process and the kinds of metrics that go into process. Well, how much time did the translator spend on that particular translation? Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Yep. How much time did the translator spend on this particular translation? Did it make sense for the amount of content that was there? Again, how many issues did he or she raise? How many unresolved issues? Maybe the translator asked really brilliant questions that really deserve and need an answer to do a great job with this. However, the customer didn't answer, or the LSP didn't answer back. What about due dates? What about time zones? We talked about edit distance a little bit. What about the number of workflow steps? Do you have too many workflow steps in your process? Do you have not enough? Are there smart ways that you can think about improving that workflow process that makes sense for the particular type of content and a variety of other variables? Time spent is a super interesting one, because you can end up with workflow steps where you have not enough time at particular workflow steps or too much time at different workflow steps. So for example, let's suppose you had a typical sort of TEP process, and the P was an internal review. Let's call it an internal review process. If it turns out that the translation and editing part gets turned around in 24 or 48 hours, but then your customer is taking 6 weeks to do the internal review, well, that's not great. What was the point of turning it around in 2 days in the first place if your customer is the bottleneck right there? But I can also tell you that if you knew that your translator was taking an appropriate time to do the translation step, but every single time your editor was taking 1 second to review this every single time, one of two things is going on there. Either your translator is so fantastic that they do not need an editor, or your editor is playing a game with you. And so finding a way to look at these different workflow steps can be really great. How many characters are changed? What was the quality of the translation memory? How many people have interacted with the strings? Lots of different metrics that people can think about. So what do we do at SmartLang? This is just the way we tackle this, the way we approach this. And these are really just meant as some different ideas to show you some different things, the way we think about it. And maybe this is something that as a language service provider, you're already doing, or some things that you can think about. For every single piece of content that is translated, every string, every segment of translation that occurs within SmartLang, we track and store and analyze over 125 different data points for every single translation that occurs. Here's a small sampling of what some of those things are. Was the glossary adhered to? Was proper terminology employed? Are there spelling mistakes? Did the string length make sense? Hey, this English sentence was 200 characters, and we would have expected the German version of this string to be X% longer, but unfortunately it turns out to be 20 characters. Now maybe it's right, but then again maybe there's something else that's going into this. And so these are some of the kinds of string level data and metrics that we put together. Now here's where it gets interesting. In the tech industry, which is also the industry that SmartLang operates in, Machine learning is right now one of the most overhyped and overused words, and every company out there is figuring out, how do I use data and properly employ that data and leverage that data so that I can understand what's going on. And one of the hot new areas, and this is a real thing, remember when SmartLink started, about 8.5 years ago, at the time, we were pushing this idea of the cloud, and we were focused on that a cloud-based application that integrated with all of the other places where people are creating content was the way to go. And I think that has borne out. I think that has been proven to be true. That was obviously a really important trend that was occurring in the world, and you see it in your personal life. You see it in where you get your music from, where you get your email from, how you communicate with other people. The cloud clearly has been important. Machine learning, same thing. Over the next decade, and I would even argue even over the next 5 years, machine learning is going to be one of the critical things that is driving every single business. And what does it mean? It means that there is now a set of algorithms that are publicly available, and they have names like TensorFlow that's offered by Google, and a variety, and Core ML that's offered by Apple, and a variety of other capabilities that says, let me take all of the data that you have, let me put this together in a way that helps to perhaps do a better analysis and understand better and identify patterns that can help to provide insights that, frankly, humans often have a difficult time understanding and observing and putting together. It's not necessarily magic, but it is a way to say, if these things have occurred in this particular way, it's likely the outcome is going to be X. If they occur in a different way, the outcome is likely to be Y. And maybe X is good and maybe Y is bad, but we are really on the cusp of a machine learning renaissance that is happening, and machine learning is completely and highly dependent on data. So start gathering your data now. Here's one of the things we've been doing at SmartLink is, because we have gathered all this data over an 8.5-year period, and all the data, by the way, is always on behalf of our customer. It's completely siloed. It's not shared between customers or anything like that. But what's interesting about this is we now have the ability to use a machine learning model, or QCS model, or quality confidence score, as we call it, that is able to make human-like predictions on the quality of the translation across a variety of different factors, including accuracy and precision and fluency and a whole bunch of other things that go into this. And this graph is really just designed to show that over time, when we look at what our QCS computer-generated model looks like versus human reviewers, you can see that the shape of that graph is getting really pretty close. And like many other things that are going on in the world, the machine is getting very, very good at producing results that appear to mimic or are very close to human, but it's all dependent on data. So let's talk a little bit about outcomes. Let's talk about how people want to think about translation outcomes. And the way that people used to think about translation and quality, and how do I determine, do I have good quality translation, is they used to do a variety of things. Think back to the old Lisa scoring model, or think about some of the models that are human driven, where I want a human to come in and review it and say, well, I found a couple spelling mistakes, and I found a couple grammatical things, and I didn't love the fluency, and I didn't think the accuracy was great, but boy, I thought this was terrific, and I thought that was terrific. That's sort of been the traditional approach to measuring quality in the translation industry. And as a result of that, it's been reactive. It said, hey, what happened in the past? What has happened in the past to my overall translation work that was done by this particular LSP or this particular partner or this particular translator? And it's gone back to say, what happened in the past? And the future is about predictive. It's about predicting what is likely to happen. This is where machine learning is absolutely going to be critical to this. It's not necessarily about going back and saying, hey, what happened in the past, but more about what is the likelihood that I'm going to get the right outcome predicting the future. The other one is sampling. So how do a lot of LSPs, how does most of the industry, frankly, do translation quality today? They do it through a sampling process. Let me check every X number of jobs that come in. Let me check X number of projects. Let me check every X number of strings. And we'll compare a small set of things, because a human can't possibly measure every single translation that came back. So we'll sample. And in theory, if we sample enough things, we ought to be able to determine that in most cases that, it's pretty good quality. It's kind of like in the old manufacturing days where, if a factory was shipping out car radios, for example, they'd open up the box of every 1,000th one and say, well, this radio looks pretty good, so I guess all of the other 999 are pretty good. But in reality, that's not actually true. And what machine learning and data will allow for is census. It will allow us to check every single translation, not just a sampling, every single translation. It's also not going to be delayed. It will happen in real time. In real time, you'll be able to say, hey, what is the quality of this work? And it won't be something that you can have to go back and figure out later on and then assess it a day or a week or a month or a quarter or a year later. And then finally, the problem with the traditional method for determining quality and outcomes has been very, very resource intensive. And the future holds a data-driven, automated approach to this. Guess what? This is how SmartLink thinks about its quality confidence score. It thinks about all of those different factors, and we believe that there are significant benefits to the end customer. Number one, they want to get their content to market as quickly as possible. And when you can use data around people, content, processes, you can automate, you can use a census approach, you can do this in real time, and that it's not resource intensive, you help customers to get really comfortable with the quality of the great work that your LSP is doing, and that they can get content to market faster, perhaps by even skipping things like a bottleneck internal review if it's not necessary to do it. Overall, then, you can start to reduce the cost of translation. Now, this doesn't mean, hey, I'm asking translators to take 3 pennies less per word on this necessarily. What it really means is it means that the overall cost of translation, including all of the manual repetitive processes that you're doing, all the manual repetitive processes that you're doing, that your customers are doing, and so on, that you can reduce all of those parts, and effectively you can translate more. Isn't that great? Don't we all want more business? And you can ensure the quality of translations that customers need for their content. For some content, that really important marketing content on the homepage, where you're trying to convince a customer, a potential customer to buy your new phone or buy your new camera or to sign up for your vacation package or to book a room, that's going to be a different kind of translation quality than the long tail content on your e-commerce site for the 100,000th item on your e-commerce site. And so let's ensure the kind of quality that people are using. Let's look at some use cases here really quickly. So if you buy this so far, as a summary, if you buy the idea that data is critically important to everything in the world, it's going to be super important to LSPs. Data is going to be aggregated largely around people, content, and processes, and that data is going to be used in a machine learning capacity to help benefit our customers. Let's look at a couple different use cases that are in place today. Number one is identifying bottlenecks. This has often been a really big challenge, particularly if you're not gathering the data. If you're not gathering the data and you don't understand the metrics of what you're trying to accomplish, where are the bottlenecks? We've seen bottlenecks in project managers. We've seen bottlenecks in poor quality content that by the time the customer, the actual buyer, the customer fixes their content and gets it right, that can be a bottleneck. We've seen bottlenecks around context. We've seen bottlenecks around any of the different workflow steps, the translation step, the editing step, and boy, one of the big ones we often see is the internal review. The internal review is something that customers really think that they want to do, but in reality, what we found, and we have the data to show this, is that in many cases, when customers do internal reviews, the amount of content that they actually change, if you had 100,000 strings, and the number of strings that the internal reviewer actually changes is very, very small. And I'm talking single-digit percentages. And if you look at the actual characters that they're changing, in many cases, they're very, very small as well. Look, the LSPs have a great track record. LSPs have a great track record of doing high-quality translation and knowing how to add the right value to get a great result from this. But customers often still think they need this expensive insurance policy of an internal review. And what we've been able to help customers to understand is, number one, this is a really long delay to get your content to market. And number two, if we were to assess the quality of the translation using machine learning and compare it to what your own internal people are doing, guess what? They're pretty close. And so you can be comfortable that 98% or whatever it is of your content, your LSP did a great job on it. So let's get it out the door. Let's get it to market. Let's get it to your customers. But this 2% over here, something is weird about it. Something may have gone wrong. And so go spend some time over on this 2%. So that's a really important one. Here's one, dynamic workflows. So we love our workflows in the translation industry, don't we? We love our TEP, we love our 5-step, gold standard process and all these other things. And, one of the things that's interesting about these workflows is they tend not to be a one-size-fits-all. They tend not to be a, we go translation, then we do editing, then we do a review step, and we do that for every single piece of content across the board. Well, what if you had a workflow that dynamically could figure out things like, hey, this is a 98% TM match. Maybe it doesn't need to go to the editor. You can skip the editing step. Or the quality confidence score, your machine learning data approach, whatever it may be, in SmartLink we call it our quality confidence score. The quality confidence score has said that, hey, this was done in a really high quality way. Maybe you can skip the review step. These are ways to cut costs out of the operation. They are ways to make smart decisions about things to eliminate manual steps that are unnecessary and that are repetitive. But they also have a really important benefit of getting the content done faster and to market. And that is one of the most important things that we find our customers need. They want speed to market. Let's talk a little bit about our quality confidence score. And I'll actually give everybody a really quick demo here just so you can kind of see what it looks like live. I have the slides here in case the demo doesn't work here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a live version of the SmartLink job dashboard. And a job, everybody calls these things a little bit different, but a job is a bundle of content that has been, that a customer said, I need this bundle of content. It might be a few web pages, might be a bunch of content for a mobile app, might be some landing pages from our marketing platform. It might be, 3 Word documents and an InDesign file, but that job has been bundled together around a set of different languages. And so I can see what those languages are, and I can see where the content is in the workflow, and I can do a whole bunch of different things with this. So this is a view of of jobs, and I want to talk about quality confidence score and the data. One of the data things that's interesting is identifying risk, and this is some sample content here. But if I see these little red items right here, I can see that the system is already starting to ascertain that there is risk present in this, and this is a red meaning, hey, it's overdue, but we can start to show yellow saying it's unlikely that this is going to get done on time, or red, hey, this is actually a real problem, and then what are the decisions that you can make with that? You see this column for quality confidence score, and so I'm going to change the status, I'm going to change the status here to completed, and so here you can see that jobs are completed. And we're starting to develop, we're starting to show the quality confidence score that came out of this. Again, this is sort of sample content. This is an actual customer data right here. But if I were to look at this and say on a score of 1 to 100, this isn't a particularly strong score right here. I wonder what happened with that. Well, let me go take a look at this. This was some content that was translated into a couple different languages here and not a huge amount of content here. And it went through these particular workflow steps. And I had an estimate of what the costs were, et cetera. But let me take a look at what the quality was. Well, what's driving the score of a quality of 71? Well, it could be a variety of different things. It could be glossary terms. It could be issues. It could be workflow steps. It could be quality check errors. Did you have spelling mistakes? Were there other errors? But what are the things that you're also doing well? And it could be around, visual context or TM leverage right here. And so, we're able to provide information that helps the customer to make better, smarter choices about what those things are. Let me check the other one out right here. And so if I go look at this assessment right here, I can see things like, TM leverage. Hey, this is great. The TM leverage for this job was 87.4%. That's a fairly high average. And, good news, you had visual context better, and benchmarked against other customers, that was good. Visual context was available, but perhaps the issues remained unanswered, and the translator was asking questions about things, or perhaps there was a problem with terminology usage. So this graph here can change. We don't think our customers are going to go in for every single job and look at this. This is a trend thing. This is about understanding more about the trends. Do I have poor quality source content? Do I have bottlenecks in my workflow process? Let me go look at some of the other jobs here that I see if there's some other things. The shape and size of this overall quality assessment, the quality assessment can change depending on sort of what in our model, in our machine learning model, we're able to show some things that people are doing better or worse. And it's really about trend information about what is going well and what's perhaps not going so well. And we all want to provide really great, high quality work for our customers. This is a way of helping what that looks like. So I'll skip a couple of these slides here. The real-time nature of this means that when someone authorizes a job, a bundle of content to be translated in our system, we can actually start to make recommendations to say, hey, you have not put a glossary into this. If you don't have a glossary with the right terms and the right term bases, it's highly likely you're going to run into problems. You're potentially going to run into quality problems because you're not translating in a consistent, thoughtful way with the terminology. So what do the next 5 years look like? We think AI-powered data technologies are going to be really important. And they're the kinds of tools that both our customers, our joint customers, Smartling's customers, all of your customers, and LSPs will embrace. And it's going to be necessary for market demand in the same way that back in the 90s, people thought, is the web going to be important? And 10 years ago, people were like, is the cloud going to be a thing? Machine learning and the data behind it is going to be important. You can't have machine learning without data. Data is critically important to this. And so what I would advocate is act now and figure out how you can start to understand data around people, content, and processes to refine all aspects of your translation and localization process and to turn that into a revenue center for yourself. That is my presentation. Thank you so much. I would love to hear some questions. Manuela, I hope that people are starting to add some questions in there, and I'd be happy to address them.
Yeah, I hope so too. So folks, we have enough time here, 10 minutes to entertain some questions. So please start typing them in. I'll kick it off, Jack. I have a question about, you mentioned the, I think, 152 data points that you're collecting, but it looks like it's all string-based metrics. I'm curious about, units that are larger than the string. So let's say website localization, each string may be just fine, but the whole thing doesn't flow. Are you guys collecting any data on, fluency, coherence across a paragraph or a whole passage as well, or do you have plans for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is we absolutely do that at those aggregated levels. Mm-hmm. And by the way, like this presentation isn't necessarily about what Smartling's doing, mm-hmm. But this is what Smartling's doing, and it may be helpful to our LSP partners and friends in the industry to think about this as well. But absolutely, we do it at a job level, which means, hey, it could be 3 Word documents, an InDesign file, and a PowerPoint file. It could be, 22 pages of a website. It could be all of the new content going into a mobile app at a job level, but that also means we do it at the file level, we do it at a paragraph level, we do it all the way down to a string level. Uh-huh. And as a result of that granularity, and that we can see it at the most granular form of content, which is a string or a segment in the system, then of course we can aggregate it together and say, look, here was a paragraph, for example, with 10 sentences. All 10 sentences had a very high quality score. As a result, the paragraph does, and that paragraph is part of a website, and all the paragraphs had a very high quality score. As a result, the web page does, and as a result, the overall job does. For example, that's a great question. We think it's important to do it at that granular level for every single bit of content, and it's fully automated. Now, I want to say one more thing. We do integrate with things like DQF, Taos DQF, and DQF tends to be more of a human-focused. A human reviewer or editor is coming in and saying, let me score this around accuracy, around fluency, around terminology usage, around coherency, around consistency, around those kinds of things. And quality confidence score builds on top of DQF, and it feeds from DQF. And a human reviewer is a really strong signal that says, here's how this can be adjusted accordingly. And so we think these two things work together. It's a lot like a pilot who hand flies the airplane for takeoff and landing, but a significant portion of the flight, the autopilot is flying, and human and machine can work really, really well together. Cool. Thank you for that question.
All right. So we got a question here from the audience. Do translators also have access to the data that will help them improve, and how is that data provided to them?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I love this one. I'll admit that this is an area where Smartling has not fully completed its mission on making sure that data is available to everyone, but it's certainly something that we're working on. And again, in the spirit of LSPs improving their own data process here, I think this is a really super interesting one. And more we hear from our customers, hey, can you help to export this data or to present this data to the translator to help them to understand how to do a better job of the translation. And that doesn't mean that the translator is not a good translator. What it might mean is more of, hey, you are now becoming an extension. You, Mr. or Ms. Translator, are becoming an extension of the company, the customer, the buyer. And here's the way we think about our brand. Here's the way we think about our terminology. Here are some of the areas right here. Yes, this can certainly find areas where a translator didn't do a good job or is having a bad day or whatever else. But I really like this idea of, in a professional, polite, appropriate way, to say, here's some areas that we think that there can be some improvement. It's a little bit like Net Promoter Score for people that are familiar with NPS. It's asking people, over a trend, how do you like my product? How likely are you to recommend it to another person, and understanding the trend over time. So I think that's a really important one. We're starting to export things like DQF and human feedback, but this is a really great one. Thank you for that question.
All right. We got one question here that's more forward-looking, talking about the dichotomy between openly shared data and MT engines versus privately owned resources. What does the future hold? I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, somebody mentioned GDPR earlier today, and if you are not getting your company prepared properly for GDPR, really think about this. And I think that is the dichotomy, and particularly for our listeners in Europe, that Europe is basically saying, hey, we know companies are using data because it's not for nefarious purposes. It's because data is helping to make companies do better things and more efficient, and we benefit from that in our everyday life. But there really will be much more concern around what are you doing with my data, and where is it, how is it being used, and is it being used for purposes that I agree with? And it's going to be really important. GDPR is all about telling companies to make smart choices, thoughtful choices, document those choices, live up to those choices around how you're using data. And I think we've seen things with Facebook and the Cambridge Analytics controversy and things like that, where things that people thought were their private data are being used in a public way. So I think there'll be much more explicitness in how you demand the control of your data, your company's data, the siloing of your data, as compared with public data sets that are used. And it's very clear that these are meant for public consumption to improve MT engines or to provide census data or any number of other things. And I hope I answered that question sufficiently.
Thank you. Last question. I'm curious, you're collecting all of this data, but I'd like to know, how do you make sure that you're really identifying the right risks? Or have you had situations where, you're passing information on that says this is all good translation, high quality, and then have had feedback from humans saying that it sucked, it was a bad experience overall? How are you making sure
that's a real
issues?
Yeah, that's a really, really terrific question. I think that's a really terrific question. And I think that the way that we would think about this is, I'm going to give an example from a medical case study. So there was a medical case study recently where there were, millions of, this was at a cancer research facility and at an actual hospital where they were treating cancer. And, there were millions of scans of potential cancer patients. And what happened was, they would teach humans to read the scans, and then, the humans would say, hey, here's 7 different factors that are likely indicators of cancer. And then they would say, this is the appropriate treatment, surgery or chemotherapy or whatever the case may be. And what they were able to do with these millions of scans was, instead of teaching the computer to say, here are the 7 different factors, I'm remembering the case study a little bit, so it may be 7, it may be 8 or whatever, but here are the 7 different factors that influenced, that were likely indicators of cancer. Instead of teaching the computer that, instead it said, here's 1 million scans, and here are the outcomes for good or bad. Here are the places where, here was sort of the survival rate of the individual person that was being scanned. Was it they lived forever? Was it they lived for 5 years? They lived for a year? They lived for a month? Mm-hmm. And then the computer was able to determine how likely was it that this scan was an indicator of cancer. So here's some super interesting things that came out of it. Number one, the computer was better at picking it than the human. because they don't get tired after lunch and it's consistent. And number two, the computer identified an additional 2 factors that were likely indicators of cancer that the best cancer doctors, the best oncologists had not identified up until this point. So what we are finding, and I showed that graph in the presentation, what we're finding is that we now have enough data and insight to say this is a likely indicator of high quality translation. And I gave an example where I said, what if there was a 200 character sentence in English and we would have expected the German to be 240 characters, but it was 30 characters. I think a human would say, that's weird, but it might be exactly right. It might be exactly right. And when you do this down on a granular string level that can be aggregated to paragraphs and pages and entire websites and everything else, generally the trends are really good. To answer the question really specifically, no, we have not encountered that. In fact, what we've encountered is the opposite. We've encountered places where some of our biggest customers have said, we do an internal review. We think that's really, really important. It takes us a long time. It's expensive. And what we were able to show them is we were able to say, look, run a test for 6 weeks where we're going to predict the areas that your internal reviewers are going to have a problem with. And it turns out it was so unbelievably small and it was spot on that we were able to say to the customer, your LSP is doing a wonderful job. They're doing a great job. 98% of your content, you can feel comfortable getting it to market. Here's the 2%. You might want to just take a little more time on it. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean it's right, but focus your attention there. Yeah. That's what we think.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, Jack. This is all the time that we had, but it's been super interesting. Thank you for sharing what you're doing with data at SmartLink. It's really been an interesting presentation. Another big thank you to our audience for joining us today, and we would really appreciate it if you could take just a minute to give us your feedback on today's session using the post-event survey. It is super short, but your perspectives help us to continue to refine our webinar program. And with that, I wish you all a good night or a good day, depending on where you are. And I look forward to seeing you at another GALA webinar soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Manuela.
Thanks
everybody for attending. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.